Alright guys, so for this fourth lesson of our nervous system, we're going to be looking at the structure of neurons today and how nervous tissue is consistent of all of these neurons. Now when we looked at nervous tissue in our tissue chapter, we saw a little bit of these guys um, because they're very tiny. Okay, so even under our microscopes, they were hard to see. Not impossible, you could find them, but it was hard to see. You might have also seen these types of cells when we were talking about psychology. So one thing that I like to point out first of all is one of my big lies of biology class, which you'll giggle about probably. This whole thing right here, this diagram, that's one cell. Okay, notice how it looks very different from like your typical cell diagram that you would see in biology class. And the reason why it looks so different is its main job, it's kind of built after its function. Its main job is to take messages and basically move them from one end of the cell to the other and pass them on to the next cell. So with this type of shape and these particular type of structures in it, this is what allows these cells to do what they need to do. If it was shaped like that regular generic cell that we're used to looking at in biology class, it would not be able to do what it does. Okay, so big lie number one, all cells look different. Here we go. Okay. Alright, so what we're looking at right here in this bottom right hand corner is this is called a neuron. A neuron is the main nerve cell that we find in all of the nervous system, so both in the central and the peripheral nervous system. And as I mentioned earlier, these are cells specialized to transmit messages. Okay, now with these cells, they have some of the same organelles, but also some different organelles that we're not used to seeing because of what they need to do. So some major regions of these neurons. The first one, sorry guys, I have a bird clock. It goes off every hour. Alright, so with the major neurons of the major regions of the neurons, we have the cell body, which is pretty much the biggest structure that we see here. Sometimes this is called the soma. And here we find our organelle like the nucleus. So these guys still do have a nucleus. A lot of the mitochondria and other organelles responsible for metabolic features are found in this cell body. Now, the organelles are going to be slightly specialized because of the function of these particular cells. So instead of having a rough endoplasmic reticulum, it's still kind of like a rough endoplasmic reticulum because it still helps with the making of proteins, but because we're in the nervous system, we're going to make specific proteins. And instead of calling it a rough ER because it doesn't just make generalized proteins like a lot of other cells do, we call it the nissl substance. That NISSL that's named after the scientist who found it. And instead of just a generic cytoskeleton, we do have a specialized cytoskeleton, especially given the shape of this particular cell. We do need a cytoskeleton that kind of is mimicked for or responsible for this particular nervous cell. So instead of calling it a cytoskeleton, we call it a neurofibril. You'll see that neuro prefix, which refers to basically the nervous system. So it's kind of like in the muscle chapter when we had like sarcoplasm and sarcoplasmic reticulum, and those were specialized parts of the cell named after muscle cells. These are parts of the nervous system cell, which is why they have different names. Another thing I didn't tell you in biology. Okay. However, we do have one common factor. We do have the nucleus, and inside that nucleus we have a large nucleolus. Both of those are responsible for coordinating messages and making sure that there is enough of the nissl substances and mitochondria and all those other organelles that these guys do have. Alright, so we have our cell body, got a nucleus in it, which has a nucleolus in it. Other regions, so we see there's a lot of like processes, and remember when I say process in anatomy class, it just means things that stick out. So we have a lot of processes or fibers that extend from the cell body. If you look, diagram down here, okay, so here's our cell body. We've got a lot of these branching figures off of it. Those branching figures are called dendrites. And these dendrites conduct impulses towards the cell body. So what these dendrites do, they reach out like the branches on a tree, and they will grab electrical messages from other neurons, because remember, this is just one cell, and you have billions of these within your nervous system. So there would be another one very similar to it next door to it. So what happens is, as that message gets passed, the dendrites will actually grab incoming messages and then use that to pass them through this cell. Okay, so dendrites are kind of like the grabbers. It's going to pass that message through the cell body onto the axon. Now the axon's this long road-like structure here, and it actually goes through these yellow orangey figures here. Okay, so the axon's this long, skinny road-like structure, and it takes messages from the cell body and takes them throughout the cell. Now the axon will always end in what we call the axon or axonal terminal, and that terminal word means like end. Okay, so literally it translates to the end of the axon, which is kind of nice to know. And at these axonal terminals, they're going to contain vesicles with neurotransmitters. Now we talked about neurotransmitters, and if I were in class with you, I would ask you what the neurotransmitter was in your muscle cell project, and hopefully you would say, oh, it was that word that I had trouble saying, but there's an abbreviation. It was acetylcholine, or ACH. Okay, that was the one for the muscle, that neurotransmitter, that one that would take electrical messages and translate it into chemical messages. And so what we see is that there's going to be thousands upon thousands of neurotransmitters that are going to be used when we're dealing with the rest of the human body. Acetylcholine was just the one that was specific towards muscle contraction. So what happens is, at the end of these axon terminals, that's where the neurotransmitters are going to be, and then that axon terminal is going to be separated from the next neuron by a gap. And you actually had this gap in your sliding filament muscle project as well. Okay, some of you use like hot glue to represent it, and that gap was called the synaptic cleft. Okay, so the gap was called synaptic cleft. So you've actually seen parts of this already through your sliding filament theory muscle project. So synaptic cleft, we've talked about already this year, is the gap between adjacent neurons, or if we're talking about like the neuromuscular ones, it would be between the neuron and the muscle. That's where you saw it in your sliding filament theory. Now there's also going to be different synapses, and these are going to be junctions between nerves. So it's almost like a synapse is where two nerves come together, and that gap between them is called the synaptic cleft. I think I have a picture of that later on this PowerPoint slide. Alright, other things that we have talked about and that we will see in diagrams. We talked about these guys already when we talked about the support cells for the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells, named after one of my favorite scientists, Theodore Schwann. What these cells do is they produce myelin sheaths, which from previous lesson we know help to keep the messages flowing through the cells quickly. And they produce these myelin sheaths in a jelly roll-like fashion. Okay, so what that basically means is you have your axon right here in this diagram. It's the yellow one. Okay, the Schwann cell would be right on top of that axon. And what happens is it literally spins around this axon and it makes this jelly-like coating. And it actually makes this structure that is just a roll around that particular axon. Okay, and that's actually like a conductor. It helps to speed up those different messages as they go through. Now these are not going to be touching one another. There's going to be gaps between myelin sheaths. And one of the reasons why there's gaps is because it's just how they are formed. They don't form all at once. Each cell would be responsible for making its own myelin sheath. So there's going to be these like gaps. Now these gaps have a little bit different of a name because these are not gaps between neurons, that's the synaptic cleft. These are just gaps between these myelin sheath looking things. I'll point it out in the next picture. And they're called the nodes of Ronvier, found by a Frenchman. Okay, so nodes of Ronvier. Alright, now where we find these neurons, so actually I'm going to go back to the one picture I like. Okay. So if you take a look here, these yellow things are the myelin sheath. Okay, and that myelin sheath, they almost remind me of like sausage links almost on this axon. And then you see a gap between them, and that's the nodes of Ranvier. So there's one, and there's one. Go back to the left. Now most of these neurons are found in the central nervous system. You do have them in your peripheral nervous system, but your central nervous system has a lot more of them, especially they're a lot more condensed. Okay. Now most of them are going to be found in the gray matter. Now a lot of times people have heard this term before, sometimes like on TV shows, or sometimes people just say it in like common speak. So when you look at a human brain, it's got like a pinkish gray coloration to it. And so kind of a weird color, but it does contain a lot of the cell bodies, the dendrites, the axon terminals, and the synapses. Okay, but in this gray matter, there's not any myelin sheath. Okay, and I'll kind of explain how that works in a second. You're also going to see the nuclei, which are clusters of cell bodies within the white matter of the central nervous system, so you don't just have gray matter. Inside of the gray matter, you're also going to have white matter, which you can kind of look at this diagram down here. The pinkish gray color is usually just on the outside of the brain and within the folds. The white matter is actually the innermost part. And they're named after this because they truly do look that pinkish gray color and the white. Now this white matter is going to have the myelinated axon. So it's almost like these neurons are not perfectly straight. It's almost like the dendrites are hanging out here, the dendrites in the cell body. And then the axon goes in towards the middle, so that long roadway, and then it curves and almost comes right back out to the outside of the brain, so that the axon terminal is going to be on the outside again. So once again, you have dendrites, that axon will curve inward, fold over, and then come back, almost shaped like a U, okay? And then the axon terminals will be towards the outside. The reason it does that is because that's how your lobes of the brain will communicate with each other. And it's also how we're going to look at and see that's how your brain does a lot of the interpretation of it. Okay, a lot of the interpretation part doesn't necessarily happen in the middle of the brain, but can happen in a variety of places. And then this word I kind of want to introduce to you now, we'll get into it more later, is called ganglia, and that's collections of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So a lot of the peripheral nervous system is going to be referred to as ganglia, okay, that's where the neurons for the PNS are. Check time. Alright, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I've only got like a minute left on this recording. I'll pick this part up tomorrow. There'll be a very short video for tomorrow, and then you'll get some practice with this neuron. I am going to upload a second video in case you need another viewpoint of a neuron. It's just me explaining an actual model of one. Okay, if you have any questions, because I know this stuff gets a little tricky sometimes, please feel free to email me. I will be on my email most of the day tomorrow. Okay, so I will talk to you soon. I hope you're doing well. Adios!